Shalom, I'm Dr. Dinah Dye with Foundations in Torah, and welcome to this Torah portion, Acharei Mot. This is a very special Torah portion. In fact, it's one of my favorites from Leviticus 16. And this is the Yom Kippur service. This is the best information that we have in the scripture of how the Yom Kippur service went. So Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. Actually, it's Yom HaKippurim, which means Day of Atonements, because there are actually more than one atonement element in it. As the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, he sprinkled the blood of the bull and the goats, the mixture, and he sprinkled the curtain, and he also went in with the handful of incense, and we'll talk about that more as we go into this particular Torah portion. So, of course, we have the reading now, and we'll have this same reading at Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And this takes us into the tabernacle in the wilderness. We have the high priest Aaron, Aharon. It explains to us how he should approach, how he should dress. There's a bit of a description about the garments that he wears and when he wears them. He has actually two sets of garments for the day of Yom Kippur, which again we'll talk about. Describes which offerings, which were the regular offerings for the daily offerings, which were the special offerings. And then, of course, the Yom Kippur service itself is laid out. And we get more information about that service in the Mishnah. And there are hints of it as we go through the various parts of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and even in the Gospels and the Epistles. But nothing is laid out in the same way that is here at Acharei Mot, which means after death. Again, this is from Leviticus 16, takes us all the way up to, this particular Torah portion takes us to Leviticus 18. Everything is taking place within the context of the tabernacle in the wilderness. That is sacred space. There's a boundary that's created, and outside of that sacred space is the wilderness, which kind of represents the world. So the children of Israel are within the boundary of God's sacred space, and it's often called the tent of meeting. The entrance to the tent of meeting is where the actual animals would be offered up. The Torah portion goes on after the Yom Kippur service description, talking about what happens to people who actually eat the blood, that they're cut off from the community. There's a section dealing with incest and how that is forbidden. And it closes out with the description of the defilement of the land, which the Lord communicates to the people that if they defile the land, that they will be vomited out of the land, because the land represented his God's sacred space, which is the earth. So that's a little bit of a overview of this particular Torah portion. And so before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, I'd like to talk a little bit, as I've been going through the portions this year, of the language of new creation, because the tabernacle, in essence, is a picture of new creation. When we go back to Genesis chapter 1, that is a description of God building his house, and his house as a place for his presence. And so all of the cosmos, if you will, is his home. That is the place where he wishes to dwell in the midst of his people. So Genesis chapter 1, creation, is the language of building a house. And so when we get to the wilderness, this would be, in a sense, recreation or new creation, as the children of Israel are rebuilding his house, or recreating the house that was the original. So the pattern of the tabernacle is, in essence, the pattern of the creation, the pattern of the cosmos. And with the building of a house, the declaration here is that order is coming out of chaos. So in Genesis 1, we have the language of chaos, if you will. The earth was tohu vavohu. And then from that, we have the three spaces, heaven, earth, and sea, and God filling those spaces, or those spheres, those realms. And so as he's bringing forth his cosmic house, he is basically bringing order out of chaos. And the word for order actually is similar to the word we have for light. In Hebrew, the word light is or, and you can kind of hear order out of that. So the sense of light that we have in day one, Yom Echad, one day, is bringing order to that sphere. And so by the seventh day, we have what is called the temple inauguration and dedication. And in fact, that's the time that the king is enthroned, and he would be seated on the throne in the ancient world on the seventh day. So that's our pattern that we have in Genesis 1. This will be the same pattern that we have in the tabernacle. The construction of the tabernacle built after the cosmos, and when it's completed, the king can be seated on the throne and order comes to that realm. Of course, I would suggest that the king, the Son of God, if you will, in the tabernacle experience is going to start out to be Moses. Now, without going into a lot of detail, Son of God was simply a term in the ancient world for a king. Once a son or a king was raised up as the Son of God, that was a title that was given to him. And so Moses, in essence, is the king who would be seated on the throne. Of course, we know by the time we get to this Torah portion, Leviticus, Aharon or Aaron has been made high priest. There's as if there's a separation between the king and high priest. Moses maintains his rulership and leadership over the tabernacle and over that sacred space. And Aaron, Aharon, is now the high priest. So rest comes at the end on the seventh day, signifying the enemies have been defeated. The same picture we have of the tabernacle. So God has defeated the enemies of Israel, that is Egypt. They have drowned in the sea, gone into the deep, which I would suggest is perhaps a picture of the throne of the enemy, the deep in the water. And they've been defeated, and so now the house of God can be built and everything put in order, and as the king rules and reigns from that space. And so the predominant commandment then is to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so that is the same commandment we have for the tabernacle, that they would be fruitful and multiply in that sphere and fill that sacred space. And so at the end of the creation week, God gives his sacred space its rest because he is ruling and reigning, and we have the same pattern, if you will, in the tabernacle in the wilderness. So when the children of Israel were in exile, it usually signified throughout the Tanakh that there was no house built. So we know they were taken into exile in Babylon, etc. And so exile and the lack of a temple where the king could rule and reign are sort of synonymous terms. Exile was synonymous really with the separation from the presence of God. It is also the definition of death, to be separated from God's presence. So the story of the Bible really is the story of the exiles returning to rebuild the house. And so this will all take place on a Yom Kippur. The Day of Atonement is the day signified, the one day, the day of the Lord, in which his presence would return to the midst of the people, which signifies that the house had been rebuilt. Now this would happen, as we see in this particular passage in Acharei Mot, on the 7th month, on the 10th day. So the 7th month of the year, of the annual year of years, this is the New Year's of the years, not the months. The New Year's for months would be in the spring, starting with Nisan. And so that 7th month is called Tishrei, and on the 10th day is when we have Yom Kippur, Yom HaKippurim, the time to afflict your souls. They were not to do any work, regular work. This is a time of rest for the native born and the outsider, the stranger within their gates. And it is on this day that atonement will be made to cleanse them from their contamination. So they needed to be cleansed. If we go back to the garden picture, we understand that the garden itself had been contaminated by Adam violating the commandment of God. And so Adam was exiled out of the garden in the same way that the children of Israel are exiled out of the land. And so that the purpose of that was to heal the land, to heal the sacred space from its contamination and corruption until such time as it has been healed and restored, so to the people, and so the people could enter back into that sacred space. And of course, in Adam's, at that time, that would be the garden. So the tabernacle really is a garden pattern. And so when the children of Israel were in exile in Egypt, there was no standing temple. Once the exile was over, God had defeated their enemies and he moved them out into the wilderness. Now they would build his sacred space, his temple. However, they needed a mechanism to be able to approach because they continued to violate his commandments. And so when we violate the commandments of God, when we disobey, God has given us a mechanism for us to approach again. Now, they had daily opportunities to bring offerings, but Yom Kippur was the time in which, if you will, the sin would be cleansed. That is, the blood would be shed in order to cleanse the altar, cleanse the tent of meeting, and to cleanse the people. So again, they could approach. And so that day of rest brought by Yom HaKippurim, Yom Kippur, is a Sabbath, a Shabbat. It's a time of inauguration. It's a time of solemn rest, which is signifying that the king is seated on the throne. And this was declared to be a statute forever. Now, and we'll talk about this in a couple of minutes, but one of the things is we have the two goats. Now, this is unique for Yom Kippur. We don't really see this in the regular offerings through the week and through the rest of the year, but these two goats are brought before the Lord. One is dedicated to God himself. The other goat, called the Azazel, is presented alive before God, and it will be sent off into the wilderness. Now, it develops more by the time we get to the Second Temple period. We don't have a lot of information here in Acharei Mot, but there is more in the Mishnah that tells us and describes the Azazel and how the priests would take the Azazel to the east, over the Mount of Olives and out into the Judean wilderness. There was a special place where they had stations all the way along, and they would basically push the Azazel goat off the rock, off the cliff there, and it would fall over and die and be, hit as it hit the rocks, etc. And that it had a string, if you will, a thread tied to it, and that particular thread, which was white, would turn red, signifying that the atonement would have, the other way around. It was red, and then it would turn white, signifying that the contamination had been removed, if you will. So all that again is more developed. We see in the Second Temple period, but here we do have a mention of this particular goat and these two goats, which we will be talking about again. The other essence of the service for Yom Kippur, which is very important, is not just about the blood, but it's also about the incense, because the incense provided an atonement for the people as well. They say that the atonement that it provided was for Lashon Hara, or evil speaking. And we know that the people spoke against Moses and Aaron and Miriam, of course. So the high priest would take a fire pan of coals from the outside the brazen altar, from the fire there of burnt offering, and the coals would be put on the shovel, and in his hand he would have incense. He would take a handful of sweet powdered incense mixture and bring them within the curtain, so into the Holy of Holies. And so when the high priest would go in, he would lay the shovel full of hot coal, burning coals down on between the poles of the Ark of the Covenant, and then he would put the incense on that, and it would erupt into like a cloud, which represented the essence or the presence of God in the midst of the community. And so the high priest was responsible for that atonement. So that also went with the sprinkling of the blood from the bulls and the goats. And so we have God represented in a pillar of cloud, like we see as they crossed through the sea, went into the wilderness. God led them by day in a pillar of cloud, and by night a pillar of fire. And so these pillars, in the ancient world, whenever you had something like a pillar or a vine or a stalk or a tree or a mountain even, they were connecting points between heaven and earth. And so the temple was that structure. And when you went into a temple in the ancient world, and certainly for the children of Israel, it was as though you were entering into heaven. And so the temple or the mountain or whatever would be the place where the two spheres meet, where heaven and earth meet. So we see the same thing with these pillars. The pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire was that place where heaven and earth came together. And so God was leading the children of Israel in that manner, and this represented his presence. And so inside the Holy of Holies, the incense cloud also represented his presence, and it was the place where heaven and earth met. And so that part of that service we have with the high priest. And it's important. not to forget that the part of the atonement had to do with the incense. And there's more description of the incense service itself in the Mishnah. Now, I talked about the presentation of these 2 goats at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And they cast lots for these goats. And one goat, again, was dedicated to the Lord. That particular goat would be offered up, and its blood would be taken and mixed with the blood of bulls. And the high priest would take that into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle that blood over what we call the mercy seat, the kapparet. And that term is kind of a misnomer, but the covering there of the Ark of the Covenant, and it would be sprinkled against the curtain to make atonement. The other goat, as I just talked about, was the Azazel goat that would be taken off into the wilderness. And that goat would not be slaughtered and its blood not used. So as the high priest was going in and out of the Holy of Holies, which he did 5 times on the Day of Atonement, he would change his garments. So we'll talk about that in just a second, talk in a little more detail. But he had 2 sets of garments, basically. But when he went into the Holy of Holies, he wore his fine linen garments. Now, each time he would go into the Holy of Holies, he was required to immerse in a mikveh. He would go into an immersion bath. And each time he changed his clothes, he was required to do that. When he came out of the Holy of Holies, take that out. When he came out of the Holy of Holies and he would put on regular clothes, then he would make the burnt offering at the great altar, the altar outside at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And later the blood, the remains of the blood and the bull that were offered up were taken outside the camp. Its hides and flesh and dung would be burned all together by fire. So this consistently washing of the clothes and immersing before one entered the camp was a very important part of Israel. We see this especially in the Second Temple period. You could not enter into the temple environs unless you were immersed. And so there were, every day the priests before they served were to be immersed. So immersion in water in the mikveh became a very important part. Much more developed, of course, by the time we're into the Second Temple period, because they were actually constructing mikveh tevilah, immersion baths, by a certain design and certain specs for the priests, for example, to go in. They went in to down steps that were coated, plastered, and the water had to be living water. So there was a lot of things that's maybe a little different than, or again, more developed than we have here in the tabernacle in the wilderness. It was Aaron who would actually lay his hands on the goat, on the head of the goat, the one that would be sent off into the wilderness. And it was there that he would confess the sins of the people over the goat. And again, like I said, that by the Second Temple period, that goat would be taken out to the Judean wilderness. It's not clear exactly where this goat would be taken, but certainly outside the camp to a spot designated by the Lord. And again, there were various offerings that the high priest made that day: the bull offering, the goat offering, the incense offering, and the regular daily tamid korban olah, or the regular burnt offering. And I mentioned earlier that whenever the high priest went into the Holy of Holies on that day, he wore his linen garments. Now, his linen garments were said to be the 4 garments. There were undergarments, a sash, and the turban and the belt. And so these were just worn for this particular day, and afterwards they were not to be used again. So the bull was essentially the sin offering for himself and the house to make atonement. And this is just a quick quote here from the Babylonian Talmud, Zevachim, which means sacrifices, 17b. It says, while they are clothed in priestly garments, they are clothed in the priesthood. But when they are not wearing the garments, the priesthood is not upon them. So we can see a similar thing that has to do with the high priest. The priests, the priestly garments worn by the priest, part of that was to serve as to atone for the sins of Israel. And also from Zevachim, it says, it is taught that just as the sacrifices facilitate an atonement for sins, so do the priestly garments. So you can see from the writings just how important the garments were. This is very significant. They treated the garments as holy and set apart, and restrictions placed on that. They were, it's not just something you put up on in the morning and go do something. That these garments had the same sanctity as the sacred space, as the tabernacle itself. So again, I mentioned that the fine white garments were of 4, and the golden garments were 8. So the golden garments were the regular garments that the high priest wore daily. The fine white linen garments were the garments that he wore only on Yom Kippur. I mentioned the tunic, the pants, the turban, all made from white flax. The white garments, they were woven with a thread, a 6-ply thread woven from 6 individual strands of fabric. And again, at the end of Yom Kippur, those garments were never worn again. And in fact, it tells us that they were hidden somewhere, hidden in the place where the high priest removed the garments. The priestly garments were not sewn per se; they were actually woven. And each item was woven seamless and made of one piece, the exception being the sleeves. And the sleeves were woven in separately. They were woven separately and sewn onto the robe afterwards. This idea of the sleeves, the long sleeves, and the long tunic is actually our word ketanet. This is the description of what Joseph wore when it talks about his long. Well, it says the coat of many colors. That's kind of a misnomer because it's actually a long sleeve tunic, which is a ketanet. And the word first originates for Adam, who served as a king and high priest in the garden, that he was wearing garments or skins of ketanet, like a long sleeve garment. Later, now this is Second Temple period. For the priest, the undergarments of the priest would be couldn't use them again, so they became wicks. For example, for the menorah, the 7-branch menorah that was serviced every day in the holy place. So the wicks were the undergarments of the priests, and also at Sukkot, that they raised up the 4 posts in the women's court with the vats of oil, and the wicks there were also the undergarments of the priests. The priests also had belts and pants, which were included in making of these wicks for the oil lamps. And as I mentioned earlier, the high priest garments, though, were not destroyed. They were hidden away so no man could wear them. So they were not actually used for the menorah or for Sukkot, for the vats. Now I mentioned we mentioned the incense, the cloud that covers the Holy of Holies, bringing at the atonement cover, the slaughtering of the bull, the slaughtering of the goats. Now when the high priest went in, he would sprinkle 7 times with his finger. And by the time of the Second Temple period, we understand that he sprinkled 7 times up and 7 times down. He sprinkled over the atonement cover, the kaparet, and he sprinkled against the curtain, which in Hebrew is paroket. And you can see here, I find quite interesting, without going too far off the rails here, that paroket and kaparet are the very same letters, only rearranged. And those letters rearranged give us the number 700. So he sprinkled 7 times. The value of these 2 things, the kaparet and the paroket, is 700, and taking us back to the creation week. The number 7, we call it a time of rest, but it isn't talking about rest in terms of not doing anything, because actually on the 7th day in the temple, that was the busiest day when they did all their work. It's a different kind of work. It's that now that rest is signifying that the kingdom has been restored because the king is seated on the throne. And so it is interesting that these 2 words have that value. 7, 700, 7,000 signify the Shabbat rest, that the temple has been completed, it has been inaugurated, and the king has been dedicated, and all of the enemies of the people have been been defeated. And so all of this is associated with this number 7. So again, we have the atonement for the incense, atonement for the blood and for the goats, and actually the high priest would come out and he would dab on the 4 horns of the altar of incense, which was just before the 2 curtains into the Holy of Holies. We have the incense altar, and which was actually kind of a picture of what was going on with the incense inside the Holy of Holies, but the blood would be sprinkled 7 times on each of the horns. There were 4 horns on that altar, and that altar again stood in the holy place. Now we do have a description of what appears to be the altar of incense inside the Holy of Holies from the book of Revelation. And it may be that description has to do with the fact that at that point there is no barrier between the holy place and the Holy of Holies, that the curtains have been removed in the same way that the firmament has been removed between heaven and earth, that there's no barrier anymore between the 2 spheres. Everything has been restored, and that restoration would take place on a Yom Kippur, on a one day. So the slaughter, we've talked about the slaughtering of the blood and the goats, etc., at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And as we go on into the particular Torah portion, it talks about those who shed blood are not in the right place, not done by the priest, would be cut off. And because there was a place designated for this, for the blood, for the animal to be taken and the blood shed. It talks about no one from the house of Israel or the stranger in their gates may eat any kind of blood, and that God himself would set his face against them, because he said that life is in the blood, and that he has given the blood to them on the altar to make atonement for their lives. And so it is that blood seals the breach in the broken covenant, and blood was always shed at the entrance to the house. That was where an altar was, because that's where a covenant was made, in the entrance to or the gates of the house. And we'll just kind of close out this particular Torah portion. There's a lot here. Clearly don't have time to go into it. But all of this language of God sending them into exile and restoring them is going to take place at a Yom Kippur. And this picture of the wilderness is the picture of the restoration of the earth and the sacred space. And the key was for them not to defile themselves within the sacred space, and God even provided a way of escape. See you next time. Shalom.